Hey class, today I'm going to go over the final exam and key terms and concepts that y'all need to be familiar with before you get started on the final. It's going to be timed at 100 minutes, so you'll have a little over an hour and a half. There are going to be 30 questions on here, and it is cumulative, so there's questions from all of the chapters that we've covered this semester. However, most of the questions will have to do with Unit 4, so chapters 14 and 21, and then all the other chapters from Units 1 through 3, there'll be about 1 to 2 questions per chapter. So most of the questions will have to do with our Unit 4 material, but there's a couple questions from the remaining chapters in there as well. So let's get to it. So for our first topic here, we're going all the way back to chapter 1 with those theoretical paradigms. So if you remember, we defined a paradigm as this kind of philosophical or theoretical framework. It's like a point of view that's used by sociologists in order to kind of undergird or establish the different theories or generalizations or experiments that they perform in support of their kind of paradigm. So we had those 3 major paradigms within sociology: the structural functionalists, the conflict theorists, and the symbolic interactionists. And remember, the structural functionalists are the ones that kind of view society as this human body, and all the institutions in society and all of the groups, social groups within it, all kind of function as organs do within our bodies. Everything needs to kind of work together in a symbiotic relationship and have the most efficient and effective institutions so that the whole social body continues to function optimally. So that's structural functionalism. And remember, that was kind of associated with Emile Durkheim. And then we talked about conflict theory, and this is the one that kind of comes out of Marx, Karl Marx and Marxism. And this is kind of another macro level theory. It's looking at big theories and comparing societies on a large scale. And conflict theory is all about interpreting society as this competition for limited resources, that there's always groups in conflict with one another in society, and that's what drives social change, is this conflict between different groups. And then we have symbolic interactionism, which is a micro-level theory. So remember, this is the kind of the strain of sociology that focuses more on relationships between individuals in a society. It focuses a lot on communication, interpersonal communication, the exchange of meaning through symbols, and kind of just wants to delve into discovering and understanding how people and different social groups create meaning in our own lives. So structural functionalism and conflict theory are kind of those macro level theories, almost like from up above looking down at society and telling you what they think about it, whereas the symbolic interactionists really want to get down on the ground with individuals and people and talk to them and try to understand how they understand their social role and their place in society. So those are your 3 big theoretical paradigms. Then we're going to take a trip back to chapter 2 here. Look at research methods, those 4 different forms of research that most sociological research falls into. So we've got the survey, field research, experiments, and secondary data analysis. So a survey, again, it's a very positivist research method. And within a survey, there's a lot of numerical data and statistics. You have a lot of a focus on objectivity, a collection of numerical data from different research subjects, and they'll respond to a series of questions, usually in the form of like a questionnaire. And then all of the responses from all the questionnaires can be tabulated and put into statistical form for analysis later on. So surveys, the kind of pro of a survey is it allows individuals kind of a level of anonymity. So usually when sociologists distribute a survey, you don't have to put your name on it. It's anonymous. So surveys can be effective because you might get answers that you might not get otherwise if you were asking someone the same question face to face. Then we have field research, and this is when the sociologist and not the research subject, the person that's being studied, so the sociologist is the one that puts themselves out of their own element or comfort zone. It requires a sociologist to step into a new environment to observe a social group or a society. So if you remember back to chapter 2, we talked about the Barbara Ehrenreich research, and that was the lady that she was a researcher and a journalist, but she decided she wanted to see she wanted to kind of do some field research to see how people get by on minimum wage work. So she was that lady that went around and worked as a housekeeper, worked at fast food restaurants and as a waitress. And then she wrote a book called Nickel and Dimed about kind of what she found along her minimum wage journey. So that is an example of field research. Then we have experiments. So here, if you think back to that Milgram experiment, the one with the different levels of shock that were being administered, if people got an answer wrong in the next room, if you remember that from chapter 2. So experiments, also kind of a more positivist research method here. And these are more useful for kind of investigating relationships between different variables to test a hypothesis. Then we have secondary data analysis. Lastly, this is a very constructivist approach to research. So this kind of research relies a lot on the sociologist or researcher interpreting printed materials or previously published materials and then interpreting them in a new way. So secondary data analysis uses content analysis, so kind of picking apart the content of a movie or a newspaper article, or the way certain groups are framed in on the news, for instance, on the local news, public records, magazines. So any kind of previously published work is then analyzed by a sociologist who's living usually in a different historical time from when the piece was published. And then the sociologist kind of tries to interpret those materials in a novel way, kind of bringing in their own paradigm, their own viewpoint about the piece that they're analyzing, and interpreting the material in a way that the original creator of that piece did not intend. So, for instance, today, if a sociologist went back and watched like old 1950s sitcoms and wanted to study the gender roles that were promoted in like Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy, etc., then a sociologist would be performing secondary data analysis if they went back and watched old sitcoms in order to kind of pick apart the gender roles that were happening at the time. Okay, now back to chapter 3, where we talked about norms. So remember, social norms, they just define how we behave in accordance with what society has defined as good or just or important, kind of the right way to act in society. And most people in society kind of stick to these norms, and those that don't cause a lot of discomfort to us. So we have formal norms and informal norms. Your formal norms are the ones that are really clearly written. They're established, and they're very objectively communicated to people in society. So things like laws or a student handbook, employee manuals, a no loitering or a no smoking sign. Or even now, if you go into a store with COVID, you'll see possibly a formal norm established and a piece of paper on the door to a business that will say, you have to have a mask if you want to enter this building. That's a formal norm. Then informal norms are more casual behaviors. They're just things that we've learned kind of over time as children, looking up to our parents and our siblings and other people in our family and peer groups. So these are casual behaviors. They're generally and widely conformed to, even without having to write it down and post a piece of paper or a sign to remind us. They become so deeply ingrained that we just automatically conform to it. So we kind of learn these informal norms, again, by observation and imitation when we're really young. And we kind of learn what the appropriate behaviors in our society are without the need of anything to be written down for us. So things like handshakes, waving hello, table manners, knowing how to wait your turn and stand in line at the grocery store. Of course, going back to COVID with informal norms, think of like the 6-foot distance, social distancing, and making sure you have 6 feet between maybe customers in a store. There are formal norms. Some stores have posted like explicit rules about distancing and masks on their doors, but a lot of stores don't formally communicate that you need to have a 6-foot distance. Instead, you might go to a grocery store now, and if somebody's standing like right behind you, within a foot behind you, it might just cause discomfort because that person is not adhering to kind of that 6-foot distance norm. So you've got formal norms and informal norms. Then chapter 4, we talked about kind of our different founding fathers of sociology. Had Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, and Max Weber. So I'm just going to go over kind of the highlights of each of those 3 gentlemen, sociologists. So you will be able to answer this question on the final. So Emile Durkheim, he was a positivist, so he was looking for objective knowledge about the social world, and he wanted to create this, quote, science of social facts. He was really interested in what he called the collective conscious, which is kind of like our ideas and worldviews of individuals that is derived from something larger, the social order, and all of our various social institutions, religion and the family and the workplace and school, and how all of these different institutions work together in order to build kind of our ideas and our worldview, our collective conscious. And he was also interested in, again, kind of establishing social facts. And these are things like laws, morals, values, religious beliefs, customs, fashion, rituals, all of these things that kind of daily direct our lives and help to govern social life. Kind of this common set of morals, beliefs, and values that bring us all together. So for Durkheim, religion in particular was what he called the, quote, social glue, the core source of social values. And he felt that religion had the strongest impact in determining what a society's collective conscious would be. He was also very concerned about what he called anomie. So he said with modernization, all these different conflicts and chaos in society that was coming about, because kind of during modernization and industrialization, all of the norms that people had become accustomed to and societies had adhered to for hundreds of years under, feudalism or monarchies, all of these institutions and these norms were kind of torn down during this historical period in which we kind of moved toward modernization. And so he's really concerned about kind of all the degradation of all these institutions that had been held up for so long, and these collective norms and values. And he felt that with modernization, society no longer really had a common set of values to assimilate to anymore. They are different value systems coexisting. Like in the United States, we have people from all sorts of religious backgrounds living in one society. So he felt that kind of this collective conscious was weakened by modernity, modernization, because people were starting to have all these kind of fragmented social worlds now, rather than just one really cohesive society bound together by this collective conscious. So that's anomie, that term there. Then we have Karl Marx, our conflict theorist. And again, for Marx in particular, he was paying attention to conflict primarily based on the economic classes in society, the rich and the poor. And he felt that all of human history and social progress is defined by class struggle, so the kind of conflict between the different economic classes. And so he set out kind of the primary conflict in society was between the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, versus the proletariat, the working class. And the main struggles over the means of production, so things like our tools, our factories, our infrastructure, who controls the natural and raw resources. And he basically said that whichever social class controls those means of production any tool or resource or machine needed in order to produce was kind of the ruling class of society, and everyone else was just kind of subjected to them. So Marx believed that capitalism led to a state of alienation from the means of production. So remember, for Durkheim, he was concerned about anomie. Karl Marx is concerned about what he called alienation. And he felt that it was kind of this state where individuals no longer felt they had control over their own lives. Because for Marx, the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, had kind of taken over all of the means of production, and the working class had no way to kind of be self-sustaining, to make their own money or make their own food without having to kind of subject themselves to the ruling class or the bourgeoisie. And Marx also claimed that people in modern society were kind of falling under this veil of what he called false consciousness, when the beliefs and ideals of a person are not in their own best interest. So he felt that the ideology of the ruling class is kind of imposed on the working class through all sorts of different social institutions. So this is where he came up with this concept of the base and the superstructure. And he felt that all society was really directed by the base, that economic system, capitalism for Marx. And he felt that kind of that base is your economic classes, your means of production, technology, money, commodities, things that you buy and sell. And he felt that everything else in society kind of emerges from that economic system, that base. And that's what he called the superstructure. And these are all of our other institutions: religion, philosophy, the media that we watch or consume, education, our politics and government structures. He felt that all of those institutions were merely the embodiments of these ruling class ideas, that the ideas promoted through our education system, through our media, through our government, all primarily serve the interests of the capitalist system. So that's your little recap on Marx and conflict theory and his key terms, and then do a little recap on Max Weber here. So Max Weber was an anti-positivist, so he was not a fan of Durkheim's positivism. And he promoted this idea of, quote, Verstehen. He was German, so it's a German word. And Verstehen means kind of trying to take the outside observer's point of view of a social world and try to understand it from that insider's point of view. And this is similar if we go back to that Nasarima reading from the first day of class, where the author kind of talks about all these different American habits like brushing your teeth or giving birth, and the way that they write about it is the way that Horace Minor wrote about American culture, and the way that he did it almost made you think that it wasn't about America. It was about a Native American tribe or some other little known society on the outskirts. But Weber wanted to, instead of kind of looking down at society in that way, try to understand society from the insider's point of view. So technically he is considered a conflict theorist. However, unlike Marx, who was only kind of interested in economic conflict between the classes, Weber was also looking at conflict based on political parties and status roles. Also, for Weber, society is wherever social order is maintained by shared norms and structures of legitimate authority that dominate society. So Weber was really interested in like bureaucracy and our forms of government and how those things structure our social world. He also critiqued rationalization and modernization, just like Durkheim and Marx did. But he was more critical of rationalization and bureaucracy. So the rational society is based on logic and efficiency, and he felt our modern world is almost hyper-rationalized. Everything is very structured and streamlined, and it kind of pervades all aspects of our social life. So the economy, your education system, even suburban communities, our systems of roads and interstates, even online dating, factory farming, the workplace, the DMV, supermarkets. Kind of this process of rationalization is evident everywhere around us. So Weber is pretty fair-minded. He definitely kind of pointed out all the advantages for social life that rationalization and modernization was bringing, but he was also very worried about what kind of the long-term effects of such a rationalized world. So he was really critical of kind of this very mechanized work environment where everything was really uniform and sterile. And he said it kind of becomes dehumanizing. It takes kind of the magic out of life and leads to what he called disenchantment. So Weber thought this, that people are alienated from the means of administration. Remember, for Marx, he felt that people were alienated from the means of production. Here's a pretty easy one for you. Just going to define society. Society is any group of people who live in a definable community or territory and share a culture. And another quick definition, socialization. So this is that process through which people are taught to be members, capable members of a society. This is the different ways that people come to understand, again, our social norms, our expectations, accept society's beliefs, and to become aware of society's values and to start to internalize those into ourselves as well. And I'll have a question which will ask you to kind of make a distinction between the different definitions for group, aggregate, and category. So a group is any collection of at least two people who interact with some frequency and who share a sense of identity that's aligned with that particular group. However, every gathering is not a group. So we have aggregates. These are also known as crowds. This is when people exist in the same place at the same time, but don't necessarily interact or share a sense of identity. So when you go wait in line at Six Flags for a roller coaster or at Starbucks for your coffee, you're in the same place at the same time as other people who are at the theme park or at Starbucks with you, but you might not be there to see them. You don't know them necessarily. You don't share a sense of identity, and you probably might not even interact. Then we have a category. These are people who share similar characteristics, but they're not actually tied to one another in any way. So for instance, millennials are people who are born between 1980 and 2000. But a millennial in Orlando, Florida, and a millennial in Juneau, Alaska don't know each other. The only thing that really ties them together is the fact that they were born during the same generational category. So we got group, aggregate, and category, and then I'll give you some examples and you just match which one aligns with the right definition. So if I said a bird watching club that meets once a week, that would be a group because it's at least, you assume with a club, there's going to be at least 2 people interacting with some frequency because they're meeting every week, and they share a sense of identity because they like bird watching. People standing in line at Starbucks is an aggregate. Millennials is a category, and then a football team would also be an example of a group because, well, a football team, you definitely are going to have at least 2 people. You're going to interact with some frequency, maybe practice every day, 5 days a week, at least once a week. And then, of course, you share a sense of identity being on a team together. Then I'm going to go back a little bit to deviance. So remember, our definition for deviance is any violation of established contextual, cultural, or social norms. These can be folkways, mores, or codified law. And it can be as minor as picking your nose in public or as major as committing a murder. Deviance does not always result in punishment. You're not going to go to jail for picking your nose in public, but you will be violating an informal norm and being deviant for doing so. People might look at you funny. But what people agree is deviant and not deviant, it varies over time and depends what society or subculture we're looking at. So whether an act is deviant depends, again, on society's response to the act. Right, then we have a few definitions here from our chapter on deviance. So we've got social control, and that is the regulation, the enforcement of norms, making sure everyone is staying in line with our social norms. And the goal of social control is to maintain social order. And your social order is the arrangement of practices and behaviors on which society's members base their daily lives. But what happens when people don't fall in line with the norms of society? How do you enforce social control? Their social control is enforced and maintained by way of sanctions. So these are kind of these means of enforcing society's rules and norms and values. So we can have positive sanctions or negative. Positive could be rewards given for doing the right thing, for conforming to norms. So if you work hard at work, they give you a promotion. It's a positive sanction. Negative sanctions are punishments for violating norms. So if you shoplift from a store, you'll be arrested. Or at least they'll call the security guard on you. All right, then we're going to go into our stratification chapter here. So remember, social stratification is the way that a society kind of categorizes its people into these different rankings of socioeconomic tiers. It's usually based on things like how much wealth you have or income, or what race you are, how much education you have earned, and then how much power you have within society. So there's 3 primary types of stratification systems we went over about halfway through this semester here. So you'll just be looking for kind of these key terms and matching them with the correct definition. So we've got the caste system, the class system, and meritocracy. So the caste system, remember back in that PowerPoint, talked about like the Hindu caste system with the priests, the Brahmins at the top, and then the street people on the bottom. So a caste system is a closed system, and it's a social hierarchy in which people are born into their social standing, and they're going to remain in that social standing, that place in the social hierarchy throughout their entire life. There's no opportunities to kind of improve your economic or social situation, and usually people are expected to kind of intermarry within their caste ranking. Then we have the class system, which we're all more familiar with. So a class system is more of an open system. People are able to move between the rankings of hierarchy in society. And again, a class is a set of people who share similar status when it comes to wealth, income, education, and their jobs. Once again, though, in a class system, your occupation and your place in society is not fixed at birth. You can move up or down in the class system based on your own circumstances, and also people are allowed to socialize with and marry people from different classes in the class system. That's opposed to the caste system. And then we have a meritocracy, which is kind of an ideal system. There's never truly been a society in which social rank was only based on merit and how hard you worked. So meritocracy is kind of based on this belief that social stratification is the result of your personal effort, your merit, what you get what you deserve, basically, in this kind of system. And so, in other words, hard work leads to a high social standing, and laziness or poor work would lead to a lower social standing. Okay, then we have some key terms from Chapter 10. So this looks like it's going to be a matching question for you here. So you'll just, when you get to the final, match the right definition with the appropriate term. So we've got capital flight, and that's when, for instance, in the 70s, this happened in the US, a lot of factories shut down and maybe moved to China or Mexico or another country that didn't have as strict labor laws or strict regulation laws or policies. So we have capital flight. It's the movement of capital, like factories, from one nation to another. And then the result of capital flight is what we call deindustrialization. So the factories have left, they've gone to other countries and locales, they have new employees, and as a result, no new companies open up to adequately replace the jobs that were lost during that process. Then we have structural adjustment and debt accumulation. So this is when we were talking about our international inequities between different countries and how there's kind of this strategy really within modernization theory of social stratification, where wealthier nations will offer loans to poorer nations, and in exchange for the loans, the poorer nations will need to open up their resources for the United States, say, let us drill for oil there, or something that will benefit us in exchange for giving them the loan. And then in exchange for that, they also have to pay that money back eventually and the interest on it. But that money in the short term helps that nation to expand and grow and become more kind of modernized. However, as we talked about in Chapter 10, a lot of uncertainties in the global economy make it really difficult for a lot of these countries to repay these debts and these loans that they took on. And then we have the feminization of poverty, and this is that kind of reality that women are disproportionately affected by global poverty. We talked about the Gini coefficient. Again, that's kind of the statistical measurement that allows us to compare income inequality between different countries using one 100-point scale. And for the Gini coefficient, if the formula comes out and gives you an answer of 0.00, that means there's complete equality across all the countries. But if you get a result of 1.00, that represents complete inequality. So if everyone in the group has the same income, or every country across the world has the same income, the Gini coefficient is going to be 0. And if all income is just going to one person, then the Gini coefficient is going to be 1. Okay, then we went over our intergroup relations in, what's that, Chapter 12, and talked about all those different categories of intergroup relations, like pluralism, amalgamation, genocide, assimilation. And they kind of range along this spectrum between tolerance, the most tolerant, and the most intolerant, of course being genocide. So for this question, I'm just going to ask you what the most tolerant of the intergroup relationships are, and we're going to look at that one right here. So pluralism is the most tolerant on the spectrum. It exists when no distinction is made between any social groups. Everyone is just viewed as equal. Everyone brings their own distinct identity and culture and adds value to the whole society. All their, and this is often kind of compared to the U.S. ideal of the salad bowl society, where you have all these different ingredients in your salad, and combined, when you take a bite with all the different ingredients, it's so delicious. So it's all about this mutual respect on part of all cultures, creating this multicultural environment of acceptance. And back to our definition of minority groups. So minority group is any group of people who, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, are singled out from others in society in which they live, and they receive differential or unequal treatment based on those characteristics, and who over time may come to regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. Minority groups are also referred to as subordinate groups, while majority groups are kind of labeled the dominant group when it comes to social power. And a minority group, notably, does not necessarily mean that the group is a numerical minority. So, for instance, large groups can be labeled as a minority group if they're lacking in power. So in apartheid South Africa, certainly Black citizens of South Africa outnumbered the white citizens by far. However, There was a whole structure of laws and policies and norms in the country that made this larger numerical group of the Black South Africans into a minority group because they lacked power. So it's really that lack of power that's the main characteristic of a minority group. And take a little turn back to our waves of feminism from the chapter on gender, sex, and sexuality. So we had that first wave, second wave, and third wave. First wave was really all about voting and political participation. So in the 1860s, we had women's suffrage organizations organizing, advocating for the temperance movement, as well as suffrage, and also arguing that women should have a greater role in public life and politics and policy decisions. Then in 1916, we have the National Women's Party form, and they advocated for an amendment to the Constitution to ensure a woman's right to vote. And 3 years later, we have the 19th Amendment passing through the Senate. So first wave is really all about voting, political participation. Second wave, kind of the vote had been gained in 1919, so feminism moved to kind of a new critique. It focused more on the woman's role in the household. Feminists during second wave didn't want women to be just relegated to being a housewife. They wanted women to be able to join the workforce and on an equal ground with men. And they also, of course, this is during the time of the birth control pill and Roe versus Wade. So second wave feminism also gave greater expression to women's sexuality and, again, that fight for reproductive rights. And then the third wave is kind of where we are now. It's more about kind of individuality, creativity, diversity. And there's less of a focus on political activism and more focus on just personal empowerment and social change. Then let's see, chapter 13 on aging and elderly talked about Dr. Jack Kevorkian and thanatology, which is that systematic study of death and dying, and that issue of kind of being able to, quote, die with dignity. So I had y'all watch that movie. Some of you wrote your Unit 3 discussion response about Jack Kevorkian, which I found really interesting to read your responses. Y'all are really good writers and had some great things to say. So just remember that Dr. Jack Kevorkian, he was a staunch advocate of physician-assisted suicide or the voluntary or physician-assisted use of lethal medication provided by a medical doctor to end somebody's life. Oregon was the first state to pass a law allowing it in 1997, and since then a few other states have also legalized the practice. And then later in that chapter I talked about the different kind of challenges that face the elderly, a really primary one being mistreatment and abuse. So obviously as we get older we become more dependent on other people, again, for our care. And so elder abuse, or when a caretaker intentionally deprives somebody, an older person, of proper care or even harms them, this is classified as elder abuse. And these caregivers might be family members or friends or health professionals, or even employees at a nursing home or a senior housing center. So there's 5 major categories of elder abuse. Physical abuse, like hitting or shaking, sexual abuse, like rape or coerced nudity, psychological abuse, verbal harassment, humiliation, neglect or failure to provide adequate care, not properly bathing someone, not cleaning their soiled bedding, not adequately giving them enough water to drink so they're dehydrated. And then also financial abuse or exploitation. So making changes to somebody's will, or adding additional names to their bank accounts or their credit cards. So now we're at our chapter 14 questions here. You've got, what is a family? So simple definition, you've got a family is a socially recognized group, usually joined by blood, marriage, cohabitation, or adoption, and it forms an emotional connection and serves as an economic unit of society. And then we have our family of orientation versus our family of procreation. So your family of orientation, that's the family that kind of orients you to society, to social norms. So it's the family that you're born into. And then you have your family of procreation, which is the family that you create through marriage, and possibly through having children or adopting children. Then talk about the difference between monogamy and polygamy, and then the different types of polygamy. So monogamy is kind of what we're pretty much used to in the US. It's when someone's just married to one person at a time. But in other cultures, in Africa and East Asia, polygamy is still practiced. So that's when marriage to more than one person at a time is allowed and almost a social norm. So while it's acceptable in these cultures to marry more than one person, in practice only about 10% of men in those cultures actually has more than one wife. So there's two types of polygamy, polygyny and polyandry. So polygyny is one man married to multiple women, to more than one woman. And 99% of polygamous cultures practice polygyny. So that's what you see like in Mormonism. And then on the other hand, you have polyandry. And that's when one woman is married to more than one man. It's not very common. It only really occurs in about 1% of polygamous cultures. And we have some key definitions from chapter 14 here. Kinship is one's traceable ancestry. It's based on blood, marriage, or adoption. So when you go to some of these Ancestry.com websites, what you're really looking up is your kinship line, your traceable ancestry. Then you have marriage. It's a legally recognized social contract between two people, traditionally, and is usually based on a sexual relationship and implies a permanence of the union. And cohabitation is when a man and a woman live together in a sexual relationship or a romantic relationship without being married. Intimate partner violence is domestic violence that occurs between spouses, but also unmarried couples, cohabitating couples, and same-sex couples. And then shaken baby syndrome. We talked about child abuse. Shaken baby syndrome is more common than we would hope for it to be, certainly, but it is usually occurs when a parent is just very overwhelmed with the responsibilities of parenting, and they might end up shaking the baby in order to get he or she to quiet down, and as a result, the baby might experience brain swelling or retinal hemorrhage resulting from that forceful shaking, and can cause a lasting impact to the infant's skull and brain as well. Now to chapter 21, got our forms of collective behavior. So remember, collective behavior is any non-institutionalized activity in which several or many people voluntarily engage. So things like a flash mob or a group of commuters on a train trying to get home from work. So 3 primary forms of collective behavior. We have the crowd, the mass, and the public. So the crowd is a large number of people in close proximity. So let's say a Black Friday sale at Walmart. It's just a bunch of people there. They're close together, but that's really all they have to do with each other. They're just there for that sale. Then we have the mass. This is a large number of people with a common interest, though they may not be in close proximity. And then the public is an unorganized, relatively diffuse group of people with shared ideas and ideological viewpoints. So the crowd was one of those 3 types of collective behavior, but there are 4 types of crowds. So we'll go through these real quick. So you got the casual crowd. These are people who are at the same place at the same time, but they're not really interacting. Again, like a shopping mall or the line at the grocery store. Then we have a conventional crowd. So these are people who come together regularly for a scheduled event. So people who get together every Sunday morning, 11 a.m. at church. That's your conventional crowd. Then your expressive crowd is when people come together to express an emotion. So events like a funeral or a wedding or a birthday party. You'll find an expressive crowd there. And then an acting crowd. This is when people come together to focus on a specific goal or action, such as a protest movement or a riot. They're getting together to act together. Right, and then we have our social movement categories here. So reform movements, revolutionary movements, religious or redemptive movements, alternative movements, and resistance movements. So reform movements, they seek to change something very specific about the social structure. So for instance, the Dreamers in America, and people who have been trying to alter our immigration laws and reform them so that young people who were brought here before the age of 18 will be able to apply for citizenship in the U.S. without being penalized. Things like the human rights campaigns, advocacy for marriage equality, trying to reform marriage laws to bring in LGBTQ individuals, anti-nuclear groups, and a group like PETA, who's fighting for the rights of animals and animal welfare. So these are movements that just want to change something very specific about society. Then you have revolutionary movements, and these are, just like it's in the name, more revolutionary. They want to completely change every aspect of society. So groups like the Weather Underground during the 1960s, or like the Black Panthers as well, or other kind of anarchist or Marxist groups. Then you have religious and redemptive movements, and these are your quote-unquote meaning-seeking movements that have a goal of kind of provoking spiritual growth and inner change in individuals. So we can classify certainly a lot of cults into this category, things like Heaven's Gate, the Branch Davidians, even Scientologists. And then we have alternative movements. These are those that are focused on self-improvement, more about limited, specific changes that individuals can make to their own beliefs or behaviors. So diet fads like the keto diet, or veganism or vegetarianism, or transcendental meditation, yoga, these kinds of things are alternative movements. And then resistance movements are those that have seen a change happen in society and they don't like it, so they are resisting that change. They seek to prevent or undo changes to the social structure. So Roe versus Wade was passed, and then we had a huge pro-life movement kind of come about in resistance to that ruling. You have the Ku Klux Klan, certainly a resistance movement to the abolition of slavery and the abolition of Jim Crow laws. So there's your 5 types of social movements there, and I'll just give you pretty simple definition, and you just match them with the best category. Then social change, just a definition reminder for you. Social change is any change in society that's created through social movements, but it can also be created by external factors like environmental shifts, population changes, institutional revolutions, and technological innovations. So any change in the status quo, whether it's intentional or random, caused by humans or a natural disaster, can lead to social change. Or a virus called COVID-19. Right, then just be familiar with what the digital divide is referring to. So again, that digital divide is the increasing gap between those who have access to a computer and the internet and those that do not. So we often talk about the internet as the World Wide Web, WWW, but it really is not quite worldwide yet. We might get there, but certainly at this time, there's a pretty big disparity in terms of what countries have greater access to the internet and that form of networking and knowledge acquisition, and countries that don't really have the resources to install the infrastructure that's needed for internet communications, and don't have the money to provide laptops, cell phones, computers, tablets, the way that we are able to do in the United States and other kind of more Western societies. Then in chapter 21, went over 3 kind of theoretical perspectives on social movements, which are derived from kind of those big 3 paradigms. So we've got resource mobilization theory, which comes out of structural functionalism. Got framing analysis, which is derived from symbolic interactionism. And new social movement theory kind of comes out of conflict theory. So we will look at each one of these, just kind of the basic definitions for each one here. So resource mobilization theory is one that sees social movements as needing to wait for all the right circumstances to align in order for the movement to be successful. So a movement has to have primarily access to money and resources, and also a physical infrastructure, some place to meet and work and call supporters from telephone lines. But you also need other resources, such as kind of networks of people who can help you from previously established social movements, and different organizations that can be called upon, like a special interest group, in order to help fight for a common cause. We choose the right time and place for a social movement, and that's crucial for resource mobilization theory. Everything needs to align, all the stars need to line up in order for real change to happen. So you have to wait on these kind of political opportunities for success or failure, and that success or failure may also depend greatly on whether the public generally supports it, or if they support the leadership in power at a specific point in time. And we have framing analysis, which comes out of symbolic interactionism. So frames explain how individuals identify and interpret social events and which norms they think they should follow in a given situation. So framing a certain issue or a topic explains how a social movement's cause is communicated by using language, argumentation that shapes the public debate in their favor. So framing has a way of kind of simplifying big social issues into easily understandable slogans. So think about during chapter 21, kind of had a little slide that showed you the different way that the pro-choice movement and the pro-life movement have framed their position on the issue of abortion in different ways in order to communicate their perspective to the public. And then we have the frame alignment process, and this is when different social movements can merge their goals and come together within a new movement in order to get something new accomplished. So, for instance, movements for women's rights, racial equality, and LGBTQ advocacy often can work together under kind of bigger issues that affect all of them, like human rights organizations and movements. And new social movement theory is kind of derived from conflict theory. So this one argues that modern social movements are no longer based on economic or political concerns, but on cultural concerns. So since the 1980s, social movements have become more and more focused on issues of identity rather than politics. So new social movement theory is saying that a lot of the conflict in society today isn't about whether you're rich or poor or Republican or Democrat strictly, but it's more about your ideology and your identity being in conflict with someone else's identity. So these movements revolve, fittingly, around a politics of identity. The goal is really to gain acceptance for more stigmatized groups of people, like ethnic, ecological, indigenous minorities, LGBTQ individuals, and women. Their organization is pretty democratic. They try to stay away from kind of these bureaucratic, hierarchical organizations. They want everyone to kind of have equal say in the movement. And they employ new forms of engagement like direct action. So if you've ever seen kind of a TV show or a movie that shows somebody, maybe like an environmentalist, doesn't want a tree to be cut down, so he or she goes and chains themselves to the tree and says, "Save the tree." That is an example of direct action. You're really putting your body, your physical body, in direct conflict with whatever is happening that you're not happy with. So within social movement theory, new social movement theory, civil society becomes the target of the revolution. Not the economy, not the nation state, but civil society is the target of these kinds of movements. They want to change the way that society at large thinks or talks about certain issues. So this way of organizing is again derived from conflict theory, and the aim is kind of to get some sense of emancipation or recreation of civil society outside of state power. And with that, we have made it to the end of this final exam review. So I wish you all good luck. Take a little time, study, review everything. Make sure you took the Chapter 14 and Chapter 21 quizzes, because those will help you prepare for the final as well. And really glad to have you all in the class this semester. I hope you all will reach out to me in the future if you ever need advice or a recommendation or a sponsor, or if you ever just think back, something happens in your life or in the world and you want to talk about some things that we talked about in this class, please reach out to me. You all have my email address. Hopefully soon we'll be on campus again, and I really hope to meet a lot of you in the future and come visit me in Patrick Hall. All right, I hope you all have a great day. Good luck on the final. Y'all got this. You've been a great group of students, and I wish you well. I hope you have a great end to the semester and a good break. Take some time to relax and spend time with your loved ones and get ready for next semester, unless you're graduating, in which case, congratulations. All right, guys, hope to talk to you in the future. Bye.